The dog wouldn't stop digging. That was the first thing Walter noticed when he stepped out of the truck that cold October morning. His German shepherd, Scout, already at the side of the old equipment shed, pawing at the frozen ground like something down there was calling to him. Walter stood for a moment, one hand on the truck door, and just watched. He'd had Scout for 4 years by then. 4 years, and he'd never seen the dog act like that. Not frantic, not playful, something focused, something certain. "Hey," Walter called. His voice came out rough from the drive. "Come on, boy." Scout didn't even look up. Walter pulled his jacket tighter and walked across the dead grass toward him, his boots crunching on the frost. The property around him was quiet, the way only rural Alberta could be quiet. A deep, held breath kind of silence that pressed against the ears. Pine trees on 3 sides. A gray sky the color of old tin. The farmhouse behind him, with its sagging porch and its windows filmed with years of dust. His brother Daniel had called it a gift. Walter had a different word for it. He'd driven up from Red Deer alone, the way he did most things now. His daughter Melissa had offered to come. His son-in-law Greg had offered to help with the estate paperwork. Walter had thanked them both and told them he'd be fine. And he'd said it in the tone he'd been using for 30 years. The one that ended conversations without being unkind. The farm had belonged to his father's older brother, a man named Raymond who Walter had met maybe 6 times in his whole life. Raymond had never married, never had children. He'd worked this land for 50 years by himself, which Walter understood better than most people would have expected. And when Raymond died in August at the age of 83, the property had passed, through a will that apparently no one in the family had known existed, to Walter. Not to Daniel, not to their cousins out in Medicine Hat. To Walter. His lawyer in Red Deer had read him the relevant paragraph over the phone. To my nephew, Walter James Kowalczyk, who served when serving cost something. He'll know what to do with it. Walter had sat in his kitchen for a long time after that call, looking at nothing. He was 64 years old. He'd served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 22 years. Infantry, 2 deployments to Bosnia, 1 to Afghanistan, and then he'd come home and spent the next 2 decades doing things that looked like living without quite being it. A job managing logistics for a construction firm. A marriage that lasted 11 years before Sandra finally said she couldn't carry both of them anymore. A small apartment he kept very clean and very empty. Scout had come from a rescue organization in Lacombe. The woman who ran it had said he was a mix, probably shepherd and something else, and that he'd been found tied to a fence post outside Ponoka, with no food or water. Walter had brought him home, and they'd understood each other from the first evening. That was more than he could say about most people he'd known. He crouched down beside Scout and looked at what the dog had found. It wasn't ground he was digging at. Walter saw that now. It was the base of the shed wall, old weathered boards, gray as driftwood, with a gap at the bottom where something had rotted through. Scout had his nose jammed into that gap, sniffing hard, tail moving in tight, urgent arcs. Walter pulled his work gloves on and tugged at the loose board. It came away easier than he expected. Behind it, in the crawl space beneath the shed floor, there was a wooden box. Not buried, just tucked in, pushed back against the stone foundation. Maybe 2 feet wide, hinged lid, no lock. A piece of old cloth folded on top. Walter sat back on his heels and stared at it. Scout sat beside him, perfectly still now, as if his job was done. "All right," Walter said quietly. "All right." He reached in and pulled it out. The inside of the shed was too dark to see well, so he carried the box to the porch and set it on the wooden steps. Scout followed close, occasionally pressing his flank against Walter's leg. Inside the box, a bundle of letters held together with kitchen twine, a small tape recorder, the old kind that took cassettes, along with 3 cassettes in cracked plastic cases, a photograph, black and white, of a man and a boy standing in front of what looked like this same farmhouse, 50 years younger. And underneath everything else, a folded piece of paper with Walter's name written on the front in his uncle's handwriting. Walter recognized the handwriting. Raymond had sent him exactly one letter back in 1987, when Walter had just finished basic training. He'd told Walter that the hardest part wasn't the training, it was learning to come back. Walter hadn't understood that at 21. He understood it now. He unfolded the paper. Walter, if you're reading this, then you drove up here yourself, which is what I expected. There are things about this land I need you to know before anyone tries to tell you different. The letters in this box are from your grandfather to me, written between 1943 and 1945. Read them when you're ready. The tapes are from me. I made them last winter when I knew things were getting close. I couldn't say some of this to a face, but I could say it into a machine. Play them in order, and don't let anyone push you off this property before you understand what it is. Your uncle, Raymond P.S. There's a man named Garth Leidecker who will come to see you. Don't sign anything he puts in front of you. The name appeared the next morning. Walter was inside, trying to get the ancient oil furnace to cooperate, when he heard tires on the gravel. Scout went to the window and stood there, very still, ears forward. The truck that pulled up was new, one of those expensive ones with the chrome trim that farmers didn't actually drive. That was Walter's first red. The man who climbed out was in his mid-50s, heavyset, wearing a jacket that was too clean for a working property. Mr. Kowalczyk, the man said as Walter came to the door. He had a wide smile that used only the lower half of his face. My name is Garth Leidecker. I heard you came up to take a look at the old Raymond place. Word travels, Walter said. Small county. Leidecker came up the porch steps without being invited. Walter didn't move out of the doorway. The man didn't seem to notice or pretended not to. I had a working relationship with your uncle for a number of years. I'm sorry for your loss. We weren't close. Well, Leidecker luffed her into the dim hallway. I wanted to reach out early, before you got too settled in your thinking. I run an agricultural land holdings company out of Ponoka. I've been interested in this parcel for quite some time. I think you'll find our offer more than generous, given the state of the buildings. I just arrived yesterday, Walter said. I understand. And I'm not trying to rush you. I'm not selling. The smile thinned. Just for a moment. Then it came back. You haven't heard the number. It doesn't matter. Leidecker looked at him for a long beat. The same way certain officers had looked at Walter during his service. Men who weren't used to being told no, by people they'd already decided were beneath them. Walter had always found it interesting how clearly that attitude showed on a person's face if you knew what to look for. Take some time, Leidecker said finally, and handed Walter a card. The offer's good until the end of the month. Walter watched him drive away. Scout pressed against his leg. Yeah, Walter said. Me, too. He listened to the first tape that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while Raymond's voice filled the room. His uncle's voice was rougher than he'd expected. Older, obviously, but there was a steadiness to it that reminded Walter of the way certain sergeants had spoken. Men who had run out of patience for anything except the truth. I'm going to start at the beginning, because I think the beginning is where Walter needs to start too. This land was homesteaded by our grandfather, Stanislaw Kowalczyk, in 1921. He came from Poland with $40 and a suitcase, and he built the first structure on this property with his own hands. By the time our father was born, there were 200 acres under cultivation. By the time I took it over, it was down to 140 because of some sales our father made in the 60s that I'll get to later. The point is this: the land stays in the family. That was the promise our grandfather made to our grandmother, and she made him put it in writing, because she was smarter than he was, and she knew it. That document is in the box with the letters. Walter needs to read it. And Walter needs to know that Leidecker has been trying to get this land for 8 years. Walter set down his cup. He hadn't opened all the letters yet, but he found the document Raymond had mentioned, folded inside the oldest letter, thin with age, in handwriting that slanted heavily to the right. His great-grandmother had witnessed it. Her name was Agnieszka, and she'd signed it with a steadiness that made Walter's throat tighten for a reason he couldn't entirely explain. He sat with it for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and Scout slept on the floor beside the stove. Leidecker came back on the fourth day. This time he brought a man who introduced himself as a development consultant, and a woman who said she was a real estate attorney. They had documents. They had numbers printed in a font designed to look official and final. Walter let them sit at the kitchen table and listened to everything they said. Then he asked the attorney if she'd looked at the original 1921 homestead title registration. A pause. "I'm not sure that would be relevant to a current. There's a covenant on the land," Walter said, "written into the original registration. My great-grandmother insisted on it. It restricts sale outside the family lineage without unanimous consent of living relatives." He looked at Leidecker. "How many of my relatives did you speak to before coming here?" The wide smile was entirely gone now. "That covenant," Leidecker said carefully, "hasn't been registered with the current land titles office. It may not be legally enforceable." "You might be right," Walter said. "That's going to be an interesting thing for a court to decide." He'd called a lawyer in Edmonton 3 days before. Not his Red Deer lawyer, a different one. One who specialized in agricultural property law. She'd spent 40 minutes on the phone with him and told him exactly what he had and what he didn't have, and what the process would look like if someone pushed. It wouldn't be fast. It wouldn't be cheap. But it was real. He'd also called Daniel in Saskatoon and 2 of the cousins in Medicine Hat and explained the situation. Daniel had said, without hesitating, "Whatever you need, Walter." The cousins had said the same. Whatever anger or surprise they might have felt about the will, they understood what was being asked of them now. Leidecker left without the signatures he'd come for. Walter stood on the porch and watched the truck go, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite peace, but the shape of it. Something that might, if he gave it time, become something close. Scout barked once at the retreating truck, which Walter felt was entirely appropriate. He finished the tapes over the following 2 weeks. There were things on them he hadn't expected. Raymond talking about the years after he came back from Korea. Walter hadn't known his uncle had served, hadn't known it had cost him. Talking about the way the land had kept him. How working something that outlasted your own grief was the only therapy that had ever made sense to him. "I'm not saying it's for everyone," Raymond said on the 3rd tape. "I'm saying it was for me. And I think it might be for you. Not because you're like me, because you know what it's like to carry something you can't put down. And sometimes the only thing that helps is having a reason to keep moving anyway." Walter paused the tape. Outside the window, Scout was doing his afternoon patrol of the tree line, methodical and purposeful, and Walter watched him for a minute. His uncle was right. He didn't know how the old man had known, having barely spoken to him, but Raymond had seen it anyway. The mortgage on the farm was paid off. Raymond had been careful about money in the way people who grew up with very little often are. There were some equipment costs, some deferred repairs, some property tax owing, significant but not insurmountable. Walter had his pension. He had savings he'd barely touched in years because there'd been nowhere in particular he'd wanted to spend them. He called Melissa that night. "I'm going to stay up here for a while," he told her. "Get the place in order." A pause. "Dad, how long is a while?" "I don't know yet. Are you okay?" He looked around the kitchen, at the cracked tiles he'd been meaning to pull up, at the window above the sink that looked out toward the equipment shed, at the old table where he'd read his great-grandmother's handwriting by lamplight 3 nights ago. "Yeah," he said. "I think I might actually be." The first hard frost came in early November, and with it came a man named Vince Aubrey. Walter had met Vince in passing twice, at the gas station in the nearby town of Bashaw, a big, quiet man in his mid-50s, who farmed the property 2 lots over, and who nodded rather than waved, which Walter respected. On a Tuesday morning, Vince pulled into the yard with a truck full of firewood, stacked it neatly against the shed wall, without being asked, and refused payment with a short headshake. Raymond used to help me with harvest, Vince said. Figured I owed. Walter made coffee, and they sat on the porch, and Vince told him things about the land that no document could have told him. Where the drainage ran in spring, which corner of the eastern field went soft after heavy rain and how to manage it. The history of Leidecker's attempts to consolidate parcels in the area, and the names of 2 other families who'd sold under pressure they later regretted. He's not going to stop, Vince said, about Leidecker. I know. You planning on staying? Walter looked out at the property. The pines, the equipment shed with its new board, where he'd replaced the rotted one. The field beyond, pale brown and waiting under the November light. Yes, he said. It was the first time he'd said it aloud, and known, while saying it, that it was true. There was a morning in late November, a Saturday, no particular reason for it, when Walter woke before dawn and couldn't get back to sleep. He lay there for a while in the way he'd spent many nights over many years, waiting for something he couldn't name to pass. Then Scout jumped up onto the bed, which he didn't usually do, and pressed his warm weight against Walter's side, and just stayed there. They lay like that for a while, in the dark, listening to the wind and the silence. Walter had been told many times over the years, by doctors and well-meaning people, and his ex-wife and his own mind on bad nights, that some things don't fully heal, that there are parts of a life that carry permanent bruises. He'd come to believe that was true. He wasn't sure anymore that healing was exactly the right word for what he was looking for. What he wanted was simpler, a reason to be here, a thing worth getting up for, land that needed tending, a dog who asked for nothing but presence. The sky outside the window began to go from black to gray to the kind of pale blue that exists only in winter mornings in Alberta. And Walter got up and put the kettle on, and Scout jumped down and went to stand at the back door with his tail moving. Walter let him out. He stood in the open doorway with his coffee and watched Scout cross the yard in the early light, nose down, tracing his familiar patterns, doing the thing he did every morning. Making sure everything was where it should be, making sure the world was still intact. Some people had asked Walter over the years why he'd gotten a dog, what the appeal was. He'd never known how to answer that, in a way that didn't sound like more than he meant to say. But watching Scout in the pale morning light, moving with that quiet certainty, checking on things, staying close, Walter thought that maybe the real answer was this: that sometimes the most important thing one living creature can do for another is simply refuse to leave. Raymond had known that. The land had taught him. Scout already knew it by instinct. And Walter, slowly, imperfectly, in the way of men who have spent too long learning things the hard way, was finally beginning to understand it too. He finished his coffee on the porch. The sun came up over the tree line to the east, slow and pale and certain. Somewhere down the road, Vince Aubrey's truck started up. A crow called twice from the pines and then went quiet. Walter set his cup on the railing. Okay, he said to no one in particular. Or maybe to all of them. Raymond, his great-grandmother Agnieszka, Scout already bounding back toward the porch, with a stick he'd found somewhere. The land itself holding still and patient in the cold morning air. Okay, he said again, and he went back inside to start the day.